Fox Business Alert, we need to show you the U.S. dollar. The greenback is adding to gains against major currencies after the U.S. announced in the last hour it has revoked the license it had granted to Iran that authorized the rogue nation to sell its oil on the world market. The resulting spike in oil prices is driving investors to seek the safety of the U.S. dollar as a hedge against energy-driven inflation. In the aftermarket, you've got light sweet crude at about $72 a barrel. Yesterday, it was more like $68 a barrel. Right now, Brent at $75.75. Meanwhile, right next door to Iran, President Trump making waves within minutes of touching down in Turkey for the NATO summit. After being greeted by Turkish President Recep Erdogan, Trump made it known how he feels about the 77-year-old alliance and his current NATO colleagues, of which Italy, Germany, France, the UK and Spain did not back U.S. military action in Iran.
I was very disappointed with NATO, and frankly, if it weren't held in Turkey, where my friend happens to be a very strong leader, a very strong person, it's possible that I wouldn't have attended. And in a way, I was testing people. I was testing to see whether or not they'd be there, because I've long said that we help them, but I'm not sure that they'd be there for us. And Italy turned us down, and Germany turned us down, and France turned us down. And it's okay, but, you know, why are we spending hundreds of billions of dollars and they're not there for us?
The president has made all kinds of noise about how he would consider leaving NATO. He has made good on promises before to pull out of other pacts he felt were not beneficial to America. The Paris Climate Accord in 2017. In 2018, President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Obama-era negotiated Iran deal known as the JCPOA. And in early 2020, NAFTA was no more, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. So that begs the question, will President Trump end U.S. participation in NATO, the strongest military defensive alliance in history? Joining me now, live, Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Ian, let's just kind of cut to the chase here. Is he setting the stage to pull the U.S. out of NATO?
Well, you know, you said that he pulled out of NAFTA, which is true, but of course he replaced it with something stronger, which was the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement.
But he wants out of that now. He wants out of that.
I know, but at the time he said that was the best deal that had ever been put together in terms of trade. So, you know, it's not like he didn't want to have a functional trading relationship between the countries. He pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, but now he's trying to negotiate a new one. So, you know, at the end of the day, you still need deals. And at the end of the day, you still need security. You still need alliances. He's not super happy with a lot of the NATO allies today. But as you know, Liz, those NATO allies are spending a lot more on their own defense than they were before Trump started yelling at them in his first term, before the Russians invaded Ukraine under Biden. And also, the American taxpayers are no longer spending any money defending Ukraine. The Europeans are doing all of that. And by the way, the Ukrainians are fighting very well. They increasingly look like a winner. So NATO, in many ways, is stronger today than it was 5-10 years ago. It has more member states, including Finland, with a big, long border with Russia. They're spending a lot more money. Their weapons systems are much more advanced. And the United States is doing less. Now, granted, the Iran war turned out to be pretty expensive and kind of a failure. And Trump did not ask the European allies to join when he went in. But afterwards, when it didn't go very well, he wanted support. They didn't give it. And he's pretty sore about that. He's making that known today. But that's very different from actually withdrawing from NATO, which I think no one believes is either imminent or likely.
Well, he did light a fire under the NATO members during his first term by kind of throwing out the possibility that it could actually happen, that the U.S. would retreat from NATO, which, by the way, an incredibly strong 32-nation military alliance that came into existence after World War II and the Nazis, which had destroyed much of Europe and certainly killed millions and millions of people. But, Ian, the question becomes, what is his endgame here? The Europeans are stepping up. Is it a little unfair to say that they don't help the U.S. when, after 9/11, NATO was the first to step forward and come help the United States?
Well, I mean, Trump's endgame is he's out in 2029 in January, and NATO's going to be around a lot longer than that. So, I mean, yes, he's punishing individual European governments whose leaders he doesn't particularly like, one of whom, Starmer, is now out the doors, resigned in the UK. Macron is going to be out in 2027 elections, and you might end up with someone that Trump is much happier with. He also has Erdogan there in Turkey. I mean, he traveled to Ankara. That's a NATO member in good standing, and Trump's being very nice. In fact, he announced just a few hours ago that he's undoing the CAATSA sanctions that were levied on Turkey back in 2020. And he also wants to sell them F-35s, which Israel's very unhappy about, which Congress will have something to say about. But still, that's a NATO ally that Trump in the last 24 hours has leaned towards. It wants to do more with, not less. So I don't think the principal headline here is Trump leaving NATO. Not at all.
Let's dovetail to this promise, or at least hint. It wasn't a promise, that the president said, you know what, I'd consider selling F-35s to Turkey. This got the attention of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was very clear in his reasoning as to why this might not be a good idea at all. Listen.
For a regime infected by the Muslim Brotherhood, an extreme movement that hates America and chants death to America from that side of the spectrum, I don't think they should be given F-35s or the engines for their fighter jets, because that'll upset the power balance in the Middle East, which is ultimately guaranteed by Israeli air superiority and also by, I think, by America's posture in the Middle East.
What do you see happening with the U.S.-Israel relationship as the president tries to strike a deal with Iran? But keep in mind the situation that we have just seen in the last hour, where Treasury has revoked the license for Iran to sell its oil because Iran's attacked 3 different vessels in the Strait of Hormuz today.
Yes, well, that is the last point you just made, is the big news right now, Liz. Now, the last time that the Iranians attacked vessels going through the Strait, again, not going through the Iranian route where they can charge money and make sure those countries are doing what they want, but going the Omani route, which the Iranians don't have the influence and leverage over. Last time they did that, the Americans engaged in military strikes against military targets along the coastline in Iran. This time, that didn't work. That didn't stop the Iranians. They've now hit out at 3 different ships over the last 24 hours, including a Saudi ship, Saudi oil tanker, and a Qatari LNG tanker. This time, the Americans are saying, okay, we're going to take away your sanctions waivers. Now, that is easier to do when oil prices are at 70 than when they're at 100, 110, 120. So clearly, the Americans are saying, let's squeeze these guys again at the pocketbook. But at the end of the day, the memorandum that was signed by the Americans and the Iranians, it involved a ceasefire, and it involved, no hindrance of ships going through the Strait. Well, I mean, we've just seen plenty of hindrance and plenty of ships being fired at.
Well, they're getting punished for it. We shall see what happens here. Right now, oil very close to $72 a barrel. Ian Bremmer, as always, we thank you.